Hello, thank you for joining me. Today's video is going to focus on propositions 104 to 107 in Proclus's Elements of Theology. And this video is part of a series of videos on the elements. You can check here for a playlist. Throughout the series, I've been using the E.R. Dodds translation. There is a link in the description box for a PDF version of the text. All right, let's jump into it. So starting with Proposition 104, and it reads, all that is primitively eternal has both eternal existence and eternal activity. Now, to be primitively eternal means fully or truly or in the highest sense. And as we have seen, to possess a character primitively means to be the monad or the universal at the head of the series. We saw this idea way back in Proposition 18. 18 is the one that reads, everything which by its existence bestows a character on others, itself primitively possesses that character which it communicates to the recipients. So how should we understand this phrase, by its existence? Well, the way I think of this, these monads are not exerting any particular activity, if you will, in order to communicate their particular character to their series. It is simply by their very being, by their very existence, that this character naturally overflows to the recipients of the series. So here in Proposition 104, we are seeing that what is primitively eternal, what is eternal in its essence, has both an eternal existence and an eternal activity. So let's look at the explanation. It reads, for if it primitively participates the distinctive character of eternity, then it shares in eternity not in one way only, but in all. Suppose the contrary. Either it participates in respect of its activity, but not of its existence. He says this would be impossible since activity will then be superior to existence. Or the other possibility would be that it participates in respect of existence, but not of activity. Let's pause here for a moment. Why is it impossible for the activity to be superior to the existence? Well, its existence is what it is. Its activity is what it does. So simply put, it must be before it can do. So Proclus does away with the idea that anything can be eternal in its activity, but not in its existence. If the existence were not eternal, at some point then it would cease to exist. And if it ceased to exist, then how could its activity continue eternally? So the next possibility is that it is eternal in its existence, but not in its activity. And to explain this potential scenario, Proclus cites Proposition 54. And this one reads, every eternity is a measure of things eternal, and every time of things in time. And these two are the only measures of life and movement in things. When we talk of life and motion, we're talking about souls. So when we as souls are embodied in the physical realm, we are in time. When we are out of body in the realm beyond, we are in the realm of eternity. And he's telling us here that eternity and time are the only two measures of life and movement. And so now we are looking at what would follow if the primitively eternal were eternal in its existence, but not in its activity. And I will pick up from in the latter case. In the latter case, the same thing which primitively participates time, meaning through its activity, will also be primitively eternal, in other words, in its being or existence. And while time will be the primal measure of the activity of certain beings, eternity, which is superior to all time, will have none to measure, meaning no activity to measure. If the primitively eternal be not contained by eternity in respect of its activity. So in this scenario, the existence is eternal, but the activity is in time. Therefore, it does not primitively participate eternity, as stated in the first line. Let me scroll up for a moment. Remember, we're looking for what is primitively eternal. And he's arguing here that it has both eternal existence and eternal activity. And so the last sentence here is really just tying it all up. He has shown that to be primitively eternal cannot mean eternal in activity only or in existence only. Therefore, all that is primitively eternal has both eternal existence and eternal activity. Now, this proposition may not seem terribly important at this juncture. What I think he's doing, though, is setting up for Proposition 191, which, of course, we're going to see quite a bit ahead. But there, he's going to make an important distinction between the monad soul and individual souls, what he calls participated souls. Our souls, as individual or participated souls, have an eternal essence, but an activity that is in time. And that point will be the focus of Proposition 191. At this point, though, Proposition 104 would apply to the monad soul. Going on to Proposition 105, this one reads, all that is immortal is perpetual, but not all that is perpetual is immortal. This proposition is actually building on the ranking of being and then life and then intellect. I used this diagram in my last video to talk about Proposition 101. Reading clockwise, being is at the hyparxis, or it's the purest expression of the realm, abiding causally in itself. Life then is second, it's the procession into differentiation. And then, once differentiated, intellect is the reversion back to its cause. It then knows itself, and so it is called intellect or mind. Proclus made the case back in Proposition 101 that all that lives exists, but not all that exists is alive. Therefore, being is prior to life. Similarly, all that has intellect is alive, but not all living things enjoy intellect. And that is how we get this ordering. That same reasoning comes into play in Proposition 105. So coming back to Proposition 105, again, the proposition is that all that is immortal is perpetual, but not all that is perpetual is immortal. And let's look at the first paragraph. For if the immortal is that which always participates life, and such participation of life involves participation of being, and that again is that reference to Proposition 101, because all that lives must exist, then the ever-living is ever-existent. Thus, whatever is immortal is perpetual, the immortal being that which excludes death and is ever living, while the perpetual is that which excludes not being and is ever existent. So if we accept that all that lives participates being, then it follows that all is immortal is also perpetual, because immortal, of course, means eternal life, perpetual means eternal being. The opposite, however, is not true. It is not true that whatever is perpetual is necessarily immortal. And that is paragraph 2. But if there exist many things, both above life and below it, which are ever existent, but insusceptible to the predicate immortal, then the perpetual is not of necessity immortal. Now it is plain that there are many things ever existent, but not immortal. Some are devoid of life, although ever existent and imperishable. For as being is to life, so is the perpetual to the immortal, since immortality is inalienable life, and inalienable being is perpetuity. But being is more comprehensive than life. Therefore, perpetuity is more comprehensive than immortality. Going on to Proposition 106, this one reads, intermediate between that which is wholly eternal, meaning in respect both of existence and of activity, intermediate between the wholly eternal and that which has its existence in time. There is a principle eternal in one regard, but in another regard it's measured by time. Again, I think Proclus is setting the stage for the participated souls. The soul that you and I identify with, at least conventionally, is not the unparticipated monad soul, but an individual soul that participates in the series soul. This is a participated soul that has its activity in time. And so that's why he needs a proposition like this one. And it reads, for that which has its existence embraced by time is in all respects temporal, since a fortiori it has a temporal activity. Remember, it must be before it can do. Existence is prior to activity. And the fully temporal is altogether unlike the fully eternal. But we saw back in Proposition 29 that all procession is through like terms. Let me just pause here for a moment and remind you of Proposition 29. 29 reads simply that all procession is accomplished through a likeness of the secondary to the primary. And this idea of likeness being what guides procession and also reversion as well. This is a key idea that comes up time and time again. So coming back to Proposition 106, I'll pick it up where I left off. We saw that with Proposition 29, all procession is through like terms. Therefore, there must be an intermediate principle. There exists an intermediate principle. Now, this mean term will be either eternal in its existence and temporal in its activity, or conversely, because it is that mean term. But the latter is impossible, for activity will then be superior to existence, and we've already seen that that's impossible. And so therefore it remains that the mean must be the former. And this leads us naturally into Proposition 107, which is really just a logical implication of Proposition 106. This one reads, all that is eternal in one regard and temporal in another is at once a being and a coming to be. That which is eternal is in the realm of being, and that which is temporal is in the realm of becoming. To briefly review these terms, I want to first jump back to Proposition 50. And this one reads, all that is measured by time, either in its existence or in its activity, is in process of coming to be, in that respect in which it is measured by time. And when he talks about a process of coming to be, he uses terms like becoming, or something which becomes and never is. It's always in process. So this is what we mean by the term becoming. The term being is one that I imagine you're all familiar with. We just used it along with life and intellect to make up the intelligible triad. It is the term that all things that exist participate in. The eternal perpetually then participates being. And this idea was introduced in Proposition 87. All that is eternal has being, but not all that has being is eternal. Proclus will reference this as well as Proposition 50 in his explanation of Proposition 107. So coming back here to Proposition 107, again, he's stating that all that is eternal in one regard and temporal in another is at once a being and a coming to be. For all that is eternal has being, and that's what we saw in Proposition 87. And that which is measured by time is a process of coming to be, which was Proposition 50. So that if the same thing were to participate at once, time and eternity, though not in the same regard, meaning, for example, in existence and activity, then the same thing will be at once a being and a coming to be, but in different respects. So a being in its essence and a coming to be in its activity. And then we also have a corollary here. From this it is apparent that coming to be, which is temporal even in its existence, is dependent upon that which shares partly in being and partly in coming to be, participating at once eternity and time. And this latter is dependent upon the fully eternal, and the fully eternal upon eternity, and eternity upon being, which is pre-eternal. Okay, this one is easier to understand if we have a visual. So I tried to stay closely to the language that was used in this proposition to make it easier to follow. Body is a term that he's used in some other propositions, such as Proposition 20, so that's why I use that term. And that's at the very bottom, that's coming to be, wholly temporal, both in its existence and its activity. And then above that is participated soul, which is both being and coming to be. It's eternal in its existence, but temporal in its activity. Beyond that is unparticipated soul, which we have already seen is fully eternal. That was Proposition 104. And then above that is eternity itself, and above that is being itself. So I'm going to read that corollary again while we're looking at this diagram here, and I think it will be easier to follow. So he says that from this it is apparent that coming to be, which is temporal even in its existence, is dependent on that which shares partly in being and partly in coming to be, participating at once eternity and time. And this latter is dependent upon the fully eternal, and the fully eternal is dependent upon eternity. That, by the way, is Proposition 53. And eternity is dependent upon being, which is pre-eternal. That one you can reference at Proposition 87. So I do hope you found that helpful. And as always, I'd love to see your comments. And also, if you enjoyed this, please hit the like button. Thank you very much.